segue into that.
Yes, it is. So I guess I'll invite our first panelist to come down, and we can begin to talk. The first panel of the day is on the impacts of public access centers. Alan, you're going to moderate, and the rest of us will share some of our thoughts.
Forget about that stuff. I'm missing two. One.
That's it, that's full house.
Okay, great. Good morning. I'm Alan Inouye, American Library Association. So the impacts of public computing centers. So those of us who work in this area, we all know in our hearts that there are really important impacts going on. It really needs to be reinforced and investments increased and so on. But how do you actually demonstrate that in any kind of systematic way? And how do you get data to, how do you get kind of a path for figuring out how to improve the work that we're doing? So that's what this session is about. And we're privileged to have four prominent academics to talk about the work and their thoughts and thinking about how to assess public computing centers and how paths for improving them and for advocating in Washington, state capitals, and elsewhere to bolster their investment. On a personal note, I'm really happy that these people are around because I'm a customer of this kind of data. But I'm really happy I don't have to do it because it's really hard work. So, I'm very happy that they're sitting over there and I'm standing over here. So our panel. First we'll have John Bertot, who's a professor and co-director of the Information Policy and Access Center, College of Information Studies at the University of Maryland. And he'll talk about some of his national level data and thinking. Next we'll have Amit Schejter, who is an associate professor and co-director of the Institute of Information Policy at the College of Communications at Penn State. He'll talk about some of his research about Pittsburgh PCCs. Following him will be Richard Gomez, who's an assistant professor at the iSchool at the University of Washington, where he's also the chair of the Information and Society Center. And he'll talk about some of his work in Columbia with PCCs, so bringing in international dimension. And then finally we have Sharon Strover, who is the Philip G. Warner Regents Professor in Communication here at Austin, where she also directs the Telecommunications and Information Policy Institute. We'll talk about some of the larger integrated issues and perhaps in a kind of a respondent role. And with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Bertot.
I'm normally not that formal. John is fine. Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to come in and talk a little bit about this. Let me try and also, while I'm doing this, get the slides. I felt compelled to do some slides after yesterday's presentation. I wasn't really going to do that, but it seemed like the visual aids were perhaps a little bit helpful and might be useful in some ways. And part of the reason why I don't normally do slides is because, for those of you who know me, I pace a lot, so I'm going to walk around. But so hopefully I'll figure out the right button. Everybody hit the power button yesterday to turn off the slide. I'm trying to avoid that today. And I just find it humorous at a digital session, a technology session, we all turn the power off the slides. So with that, I'd like to talk a little bit about sort of a perspective of how you look at the impacts of public access or public computing centers and other public access technology venues, if you will, from a U.S. perspective. And I'm really going to focus in on U.S. public libraries. And it's something that I think, in some ways, Sharon and others might argue about this. Public libraries have always been those public centers in communities since their inception, right? And in fact, if you go back historically and look at public libraries in the U.S., certainly, when they were first created or started being created over 100 years ago, they were based on progressive and activism, right? A lot of people saw issues in their communities that they were trying to resolve, right? Whether it was immigrant populations coming in, I mean, you can see the corollaries to today, immigrant populations coming in, literacy, all these issues always sort of happened in the public library. But certainly 100 years ago, we didn't have quite the robust, let's see if I can get this right. Ooh, look at that. Okay, I figured out the right button. We didn't have quite what we have today. For those of you who want to look at this is the spread of public libraries in the U.S. right now. And I thought it might be helpful for some of you to actually see that, because I don't think unless you see U.S. libraries mapped, it's as impressive. I mean, it really is impressive, right? And it's not a surprise necessarily that there's more on sort of the East Coast, particularly the Northeast. That's where public libraries essentially began in the U.S., and certainly Boston Public, Philadelphia Free Library, all these others. I mean, there's lots and lots of public libraries there. It's kind of an interesting thing if you look at the map visually. There's an east of the Mississippi, west of the Mississippi going on until you get to California. West of the Mississippi more sparsely in terms of public libraries. And certainly, far between, although it's interesting how some of them follow the roads, if you look at those, and various other things about it. But in terms of just sheer magnitude, I thought it might be helpful to give you at least a couple of figures about public libraries, I think, to sort of situate the context that we're working in. Depending on how you count, there's about 16,800 public library facilities in the U.S. There's about, not quite 9,000 library systems. So that for those of you who don't know about public libraries, there's usually what's called a system, if you will, but only about 18% of those actually have branches, right? So very often, most public libraries, it's like one building, one system, right? And there's plenty of that in Texas, and you can tell everybody about Texas, and all the public libraries in Texas, but not all libraries, for example, are the Houstons or Austins of the world, right? They're often very times rural, remote, only open about 20 hours a week, 25 hours a week sometimes, and staffed by about 3.5 FTEs, right? I mean, so these are really small entities in some cases. But there's about 16,800 of these, about another 720 or so bookmobiles, right? So there are mobile services and increasingly mobile labs, but we don't really capture those in some of the data that we have, unfortunately. Unfortunately. And there's actually still 3 books by mail. There actually are 3 service branches that will send books out to you by mail, and you can bring them back. I mean, right? So libraries are, they're out there. They're in your communities by and large, and they take a range of shapes and sizes and various other things. The color coding there lets you know whether they're urban, suburban, or kind of like their sort of geographic situation. Although clearly in the more metropolitan areas, they all sort of bunch together and create sort of this, color scheme, if you will, this blended color scheme. The other thing that just quickly I'll say about this, about half, not quite, of public libraries are in rural areas. So a fair number of these buildings are out in rural communities. In terms of library service, I know we had a discussion a little bit yesterday about digital versus print and all this other stuff. Print collections in public libraries are on the decline and have been for the better part of 5 to 7 years, almost 10 years really, if you go back over the trends. Libraries are by and large moving towards digital content. Alan made reference to that yesterday. So it's not just what do we do about this stuff down the road, it's happening now, right? So libraries are shifting their collections in pretty dramatic ways, and that's going to continue. Physical visits are decreasing, right? Why is that? Well, in part it's because we all have a virtual branch now, right? We can download our ebooks and various other things off the website. So people, in order to get library services, don't necessarily need to come on in to the library. But so we're seeing this notion of declines, but if you actually factored in people who visited your website only, visits are probably actually going up. We just don't happen to collect data that way, at least not nationally, but it's something that we try and do through some of our surveys. Decreased revenue. For the first time, but public libraries are seeing a decline in revenue. That's probably not a surprise to many of you in this room. The recession's had a number of different impacts on public libraries. At the same time, decreased staffing, right? So about 4% of library staff, over the last 2 years, have been let go from 2008 to 2010, which is the most recent national data that we have. And more is coming from local budgets. And this is something I want to pick up at the end because we had this conversation yesterday about what the federal government can do and all that. It's not just money, but at the same time, a lot of the things that are coming out of Washington that impact public libraries aren't coming with funding associated with it. That doesn't mean that libraries aren't doing the work, they are. They're just funding it themselves, and oftentimes at the city level. So there is this trickle down from federal to state and then to local. So with that, I'd like to talk a little bit, so I just hope that's kind of useful to help you sort of situate public libraries, because I don't, sometimes, you know, people don't understand, I don't want to say understand, but aren't aware of just how much is out there in terms of public libraries, certainly in the U.S. So anyway, in terms of public libraries and the internet, we actually have been collecting longitudinal data from public libraries since 1994. We have had some type of survey. It's not regular, you know, because we get funding wherever we can. You know, sometimes it's been from Institute of Museum and Library Services, which we currently have one for right now for some funding. Other times it's been from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So we've had some been from American Library Association. So we have had a wide range of funding sources that have allowed us to continue these surveys. We've done about 14 of them, so we have about 20 years worth of data in terms of public library connectivity. And we look at really, what we're trying to do is look at libraries in the context of the communities, right? What do they offer in terms of the community? So we look at things like, you know, public access technology, infrastructure, capacity, the services that they're offering, and some of the challenges that they face, and funding as well. And so why do we do this? Well, in part is to try to figure out what's actually happening. We have all these investments going on in terms of these digital technologies, if you will, and capacity building, E-rate, you know, all these kinds of things. And we're trying to find out, obviously I must have the timer on, sorry about that, you know, what's actually happening. So what do libraries do in terms of access to the internet, access to increasingly digital-only services, and I want to talk about that again when I come back in terms of impacts and some other questions that I have or want to pose. Looking at digital literacy and also digital inclusion. So what do? We collect data. I mean, this is for those, you know, for those who just want to know a little bit more about the survey. I'm sorry, I'm an academic. I have to do like the whole, it's like the obligatory methodology slide, right? You got to talk about it in some way. And so we basically collect data at both the branch, at least in the past we have, at the branch or outlet and system level. And generally speaking, because of people like Deborah and all these others in the state library agencies, we get really good response rates. You know, for those of you who do survey work, I got to tell you, you're lucky to get 20 to 25% response rates on your surveys. We typically get over 70. In the last cycle, we had about an 84% response, or 82.5% response rate. So we get about responses from a little bit less than half of the public library branches that are out there, which is pretty good. I mean, you know, we get to know a little bit about what's really going on inside the communities. So with that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the data points, and then I want to move into some of the future directions and some of, I think, what are sort of the interesting things in terms of public computing centers. So in part, some of the data that you're seeing is probably confirmation of what we heard yesterday. You know, to some extent, for this next segment, I can just say sort of ditto to a lot of what was said yesterday. But to put some numbers on it, you know, for those who are in the public library setting, you know, we offer a lot of access in public libraries, right? So if you look at it overall in terms of Wi-Fi and the free access provider, and I want to get back to that in a second, about, you know, most public libraries at this point offer Wi-Fi. And I have to tell you, the uptake was amazing in terms of Wi-Fi in public libraries. 4 years ago, it was like 40%, 45%. We're almost at near ubiquity in terms of Wi-Fi access in public libraries at this point. And in fact, for those of you who vacation and other things, how many of you go to a public library to connect? Yeah, you know, I do that too. I mean, I teach online. Oftentimes, you know, if I'm on vacation, I pop into the library, run my class, and pop back out. In fact, last time I was in upstate New York, I actually made a donation to the library and said, thank you. Because, you know, I mean, I was in the middle of nowhere, which was great, I have to tell you. But, you know, I needed to get online and actually do my stuff. So you know, and it's through that connection in the library that certainly makes this possible. The other thing I want to point out is we ask a question about, are you the only free provider? And that isn't just a connection, right? We ask it, are you also the free provider for technology too, right? Because yes, you have McDonald's, yes, you have Starbucks, but if you don't have your own device, you know, you gotta come on, it's a fairly substantial percentage of public libraries, and that number goes up, by the way, in rural communities. In terms of broadband, what you'll see here is that over time, public libraries are increasing capacity, at least from the data that we have. We cut it off at greater than 10 megabits, but the reality is what we're starting to see is less connectivity at the lower end of the spectrum over time, more connectivity at the greater end of the spectrum. In fact, we're starting to see some libraries that do in fact have gigabit per second connections and various other things. 100 megabit is not uncommon, certainly in the metro areas. But you still have sort of this challenge within public libraries to get capacity. The big issue though, and Alan, I think you might have used a little bit of this data yesterday, is that it's still not enough. And the question is, what's enough? You know? I mean, I was listening to the conversation yesterday about connectivity speeds that people were talking about, you know, 10 megabit, 20, 15, you know. Most of those I assume were download speeds, especially for those of you who are on cable connections and all that kind of stuff. But the reality is you need to overlay how many devices are actually on that connection, right? I mean, because it degrades the service substantially when you have, you know, 25 public access computers and people using their own devices via Wi-Fi, right? I mean, so for public libraries, I think the other thing we need to remember with public libraries and public computer centers is that by and large, in a library setting, you're always on. There is no turn-off time. From the time you open up the door till the time the doors closes. And one of the things with the FCC, and I'm hoping that the panel this afternoon and others will kind of discuss, is the definitions of broadband are per household. You know, so when the FCC talks about like 4 megabits per second, you know, as sort of like the threshold they want to hit, that's a household with, you know, an average of 4 people, let's say, or something like that. Maybe 3 or 4 devices connecting, although if you're like in my house, it's like 20 devices. You know, that's not a public access computer center with 25 computers, Wi-Fi being used, you know, all the time, right? In a public access venue. Right? I mean, so there almost needs to be a discussion of that from a policy perspective. The other thing in terms of training and digital literacy, libraries do a lot of this. One of the trends, I mean, so everyone knows that you can go into a library and get started, right? That's what we call that point of use training. Like, you're at the device, I need to get going, you know, let me, you know, help me out. So almost all libraries do that. About 45%, a little bit less than 45%, actually have classes with curriculum. So they offer classes, they're scheduled, they have times, they have a curriculum, and it covers a wide range of topics. It's not just here's a mouse all the way up, it's all the way up to that, and let me help you with health information or dealing with chronic diseases and all these other kinds of things. So it spans quite a broad spectrum. The one that's growing, and has been growing substantially over the last couple of years certainly, and I expect in our next survey cycle it'll be even higher, is this one-on-one assistance. This is where bring in your device, let us help you. You know, or bring in, you know, you need to apply for employment or you need to apply for government forms or whatever it is, come on in and we'll help you do that. We'll give you one-on-one training. And this is what's happening increasingly in public libraries is that one-on-one assistance for those devices. And sometimes it is a device. I mean, so if I talk to my public library friends, they really don't like the holiday season. I mean, on one hand they do, especially for like youth programming. But then as soon as, you know, like Christmas is over with or whatever your holidays you celebrate, what happens the very next week is everybody comes in with their Kindle. Hey, I just got this thing on fire. You know, how do I download your books? You know, what do I do with this thing? Right? So it's a whole, you know, I mean, so there's a love-hate relationship with holidays, I think, in libraries and other public access, you know, computing centers. But this is one that is growing, and it is something that's increasingly important. Online training materials were mentioned yesterday. Those are great and increasingly being used by libraries, but if you don't have the skills to really get online, having online curriculum isn't particularly the most helpful way to approach your particular needs. So e-government, and this is actually part of the larger civic engagement piece I want to talk about momentarily. So one of the things that's happened over time, and actually, you know, you mentioned Katrina, which, you know, I was at Florida State University for like 8 years, right? So we endured 5 hurricanes. Katrina missed us. But we had the fallout, I mean, to put it charitably, from it, because so people literally left with nothing. And in Tallahassee, we're in Leon County, we had parents, or one parent maybe, and kids showing up who had no documentation. And so basically the schools just said, come on in. You know, we'll worry about all that other stuff later. You need to be back in school, right? I mean, so there are all these different things with it. But when it comes to these kinds of interactive, dealing with government sort of services, whether it's applying for FEMA or any kind of, kinds of assistance you need to be both civically literate, because you often don't know where to get the services from, you don't know which agency, and you also need to be literate in terms of the government services themselves and applying for them, the forms and various other things as well, right? The other thing, employment services is huge, obviously, in public libraries, particularly since the recession hit, but it's always been an issue within public libraries as they try and help people join the workforce, right, and be prepared, or even be prepared for the workforce of the future. And public libraries do a substantial amount of that, and we'll not have to change anyway. So, given all those little data points, and the fact that we've also done other studies and gone into other venues and done some qualitative work, much like what we heard from the students yesterday, which was great, by the way, I really did enjoy that. It's about what we call transliteracies, right? When someone comes into the library, it's not just a digital literacy need, and even at the digital literacy need level, it's device and content. Alan talked a little bit about that yesterday, right? It's also about being information literate. And it's not just how do I find a resource, it's how do I find it, how do I assess it, is it any good, how do I use it, how do I engage in that content to help me move forward, and I think we'll hear a little bit about that in some of the other presentations later on. It's also about being domain literate. So when I talk about domain literacy, it's like I need to know levels of government, who I'm getting my services from, what agencies. It's about workforce literacy, what are the jobs of the future? How do I fit into that? What skills do I need? It's about health literacy, right? Especially with the American Recovery, the Affordable Care Act. So I'm not sure, Texas may or may not ultimately have an exchange. I don't know. Maryland was one of the first, I come from Maryland, right? We're a little bit on the other end of that spectrum. I think we were one of the first states to jump into the Affordable Care Act. And in fact, our exchange is supposed to go live this fall, right? So I have to say, and I already reached out to the public library community, our state library agency, and I said, hey, this is coming. What are you guys going to do about it? Because people are going to end up in the public library trying to figure out which plan's right for me, which program, and you can just hear all the public librarians going, we don't help you make those decisions, we help you get informed and all this. So there's all these other issues, but the reality is you need to have sort of that domain literacy to make informed healthcare kinds of choices. It is traditional literacy. The other one, it's all about cultural literacy. We live in an increasingly diverse society. So how do you help people become culturally literate and understand different communities and cultures that are in your community? It's about partnerships. So what we found in our work is that partnerships do matter. We heard this yesterday, considerably. And there are some success factors that we've been able to point to, right? And one of the success factors is that it's not just online. Right, one of the fallacies of e-government, that started in the early 2000s was that it was going to be government to citizen direct, right? That whole, I don't know if you ever heard the expression G to C, which was government to citizen, all these other terms that we had for it. The truth is that never fully materialized. Yes, there are those of us who just want to do the device, point and click, make a choice, but a fair number of people want to interact with someone as they do that. And governments have been moving in the exact opposite direction, which is we get rid of our field offices as soon as we implement the technology. This is a huge problem, right? The other issue is that it has to be supported by more than just one stakeholder. There's a range of them, and I think we heard that a lot yesterday from the first panel, and looking at Austin Freenet and the others, which was great to hear about. And they have to be all contributing something. They align with goals of the community. Right? You can't just be doing your own thing. There has to be a need that you're trying to fulfill. You have to understand everybody's roles and responsibilities. The other one I want to point out, I'm going to come back to this in a second, is understanding each other's missions and limitations. All right, is that 5 minutes or 5 seconds? All right, I'm good. Yeah. How fast can I talk? So yeah, I'm getting there. So partners, missions and limitations. Just because you might want to not have people hold up your field agencies, right? So one of the things that happened in Florida with the Department of Children and Families when they went to an online forum, Access Online or Access Florida is what they called it, they got rid of about 3,000 field agents, right? Or caseworkers. They were just gone. So they literally closed up shop. They just closed up all their storefronts. Well, they ended up in the library, without any consideration of the public library. right? So knowing everybody's limitations and what they can bring to the table is critical, right? So it is about engagement. I'll just talk about some of these different projects, because I think actually it was John, you talked a little bit about this yesterday when someone asked. It is all about engagement. So, here in Austin, we have the New Immigrants Project. In Hartford Public Library, we have the American Place. It is all about end-to-end service. Let us help you come into our community, language training, technology training, citizenship classes. They actually even also hold the swearing-in ceremonies in the public library, which is, have any of you ever actually seen a citizenship ceremony? A couple of you? Man, it is powerful. I saw 2 of them in Hartford. One of them was for adopted children. I got to tell you, that one just got me. I can't, when you see those kids, it's pretty amazing. But they also do passports. And they have the passport off, the whole setup, the camera and everything at the swearing-in ceremony. Hey, congratulations, you're a brand new citizen. Wouldn't you like a passport? And can we help you with your travel? It is end-to-end service. It's about engaging the community, right? Alachua County in Florida has a library place. It is a shared facility with about 40 different social service agencies and a public library. So you come in, and it's all based on family care. You come in, you get what social services you need, you get the information, they work together simultaneously, side by side, and how do we help solve these problems? I won't go through all of these. The one that I'll talk about, the last 2 I'll just mention, in Enoch Pratt, I have to mention one from Maryland. We have Baltimore Market, which is the Enoch Pratt Library has partnered with the City Health Department and also a grocer. And what happens is you can come into a couple different branches in the Enoch Pratt system and actually order groceries that get you healthy food, and they get delivered to the library the next day. This is really important for those of you who may or may not know Baltimore, but anyone who's lived in inner cities knows that we have food deserts out there, and you can't necessarily get access to healthy foods. What the library also brings to this isn't just space. They bring to this about healthy living, wellness, nutrition, and how to prepare the food, right? There's a lot of people who've never had healthy foods, don't necessarily know how to prepare the healthy foods, right? So there's that part. The last one I'll just mention, a lot of libraries have started doing sort of these MakerBot kinds of things with 3D printing and various other things, so they're trying to move into sort of the STEM education space. So it's pretty interesting. So you can see some of the impacts of all these different things. So it's about community transformation, right? That's really what it's about in areas of education, economic workforce, health and wellness, and community and civic engagement. And that's what I think these public computer centers and some of the data show, is that libraries are really helping transform those communities. Now, I got like 2 minutes left, right? I want to ask a couple questions here that I didn't hear yesterday, which I thought I might hear from some. Are there negative impacts or negative consequences of PCCs? And I want you to think about that a little bit, because from the work that I'm seeing, depending on which end of the spectrum you're on, is it about shifting the burden, trickle down? We don't want to do it anymore. We want to get smaller government, or is it about leveraging community resources to solve problems and meet challenges? I think these are important questions to ask, right? Is it about social innovation, or is it about smaller government? Because I've seen both. I've seen some really impressive projects out there, and I've also seen people basically say, yeah, we wanted to have a smaller government, and we decreased our budget by, $2 million. That was their goal, right? It wasn't about how do we think about technology and really leverage it for better service, or to move a community forward. Is it about effective or transformative, or efficient in economies of scale? You got to ask these questions. We heard a lot of great stories, and I know we'll hear some really interesting ones following on, but these are questions we should be asking. What's the philosophy of having these public computer centers in libraries, in other organizations, in other places, or in other spaces throughout a community? And I think we really need to start asking some of those questions, because some people are really using this as a way to not do certain things, right? As opposed to really thinking, hey, how do we think about, we have a graduation rate problem in our community, or we have a poverty problem. How do we leverage all of our resources, including what's at the public computing centers, to help solve those problems? That's a really different question. So I want to end where I started. We talked a lot about sustainability yesterday. These facilities pretty much are not going away. They will be here 5 years from now, give or take. And in fact, since the 50s and 40s, they've expanded greatly. If you look at the numbers of libraries that have existed out there, they will be a community anchor beyond BTOP. And we need to be thinking about how do we continue to work with some of these institutions that have a space in the community and can assist us in thinking about this transforming communities to meet these challenges. So with that, I will say thank you for your time. Do you have your own? Yeah. Let me keep the microphone short for you.
Okay, thank you, Alan, for the introduction, and thank you, Sharon and Ken, for the invitation to come here. It's really been very interesting, and hospitality has been great. I find it kind of funny that you bring me all the way. Currently, I'm associated with the Grun University of the Negev in Israel, so they brought me all the way from Tel Aviv to talk about Pittsburgh. And, well, it's even better here. Ricardo is coming all the way from Washington State to talk about Columbia. So everybody is coming from somewhere far away to talk about something. And now, great thing, of course, the communications professor who doesn't know how to use technology.
The writer.
The writer, okay. So this project I've been doing with a graduate student of mine, Brandy Martin, and it's a project that we've been doing for the past a little over a year now, and we've called it at some point, we've changed its name a few times, and recently we started calling it Building Digital Bridges, because we found out, first of all, because the concept of bridge has been a major concept in what we've been working on, finding that people build bridges, we call them detours at some time, bridges at other times, in order to access information. And also, we found out that Pittsburgh, where we work on this project, has, in fact, is known or boasts or claims to have more bridges than Venice. Okay? And so it's the city of bridges, so what could be better than that? But since and everybody thinks Venice has the most bridges in the world, right? A couple of years ago, I was a guest lecturer at the University of Hamburg in Germany, and they also took me around and told me that they have more bridges than Venice. So everybody has more bridges than Venice. So Venice is not such a big deal, apparently. Okay. Yeah, this will help me keep with time as well. So we'll start going. So some background, I'm sure you're all acquainted with this, with the fact that, with the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009. We'll very briefly go over the fact that this is actually a law that was created to, or was passed in order to create jobs. That was the main goal of this policy. And then it seems to me that that is not clearly what was behind the public computer centers, which are in the same law, but are somehow described in a separate program that provides other things, and not necessarily has to provide more jobs. Interesting, as John brought up, maybe more access to digital capabilities actually will cost us a lot of jobs. So maybe there is some internal contradiction there that would be good if we paid attention to. However, we're not going to dwell too much on the legalities. I used to be a lawyer. I've recovered, and now I study people. So this study was done in 2 stages. The first stage was done last year. The last stage we finished just about the last round of interviews about less than 2 months ago. So we're still in the process, as you'll see in a minute, of analyzing the data, and what I'll be presenting here is partial data, partial analysis of the data from the first round, which was part of it was presented last year at the Telecommunication Policy Research Conference, and you can see that paper. I think you put it on the website, so it's available for those who want to read it. I want to start by saying, in this context, that a lot of people spoke yesterday, and by the way, I forgot to say how impressed I was by the research project yesterday, especially because I found out that it's so much like ours. And the results are so similar. It was, I was like, whew. So, but there was a lot of conversation yesterday about access to technology. But that's not our angle of this at all. Our angle of this is access to information. Technology is in our eyes, is a means, is not a goal. You don't buy a car to have a car. You buy a car because you need to get to places. And so you don't buy a computer to own a computer, you buy a computer because it provides you with certain service, and you have a public computer center. Why? So people have access to computers, at least not in our eyes, so people have access to something else that computers provide. And we call that thing information. Now, you'll have the people from the iSchools here tell me that I don't know what information is, but that's fine. That's what communication types think of information. So our question really originally, I have to say that when we came to the public computer centers, we were not planning on studying the public computer centers. We were planning on studying the information needs of the people that use them. And that was the first stage of our study. And we looked at that, and we talked to the users. But there's something about, maybe something about Pittsburgh, or maybe it's something about public computer centers, maybe something about the neighborhoods where they're at, that drew us to look more at the public computer centers themselves as institutions. And we added that second part of the study, which we really originally didn't think of doing, and actually trying to understand the computer centers themselves as social institutions. Because as the students so nicely explained yesterday, that is a major part, very interesting aspect of what we found out. And I think what we found out is a little different than what happened in Texas, basically, because it is a different project. As you mentioned yesterday, very nicely, the students talked about it. I don't need to talk about it. There is a whole change in how we understand digital divides. We don't talk only about supply side. We talk about the demand side. We don't talk only about socioeconomic differences. We also talk about differences between, within socioeconomic groups. There are other reasons people do not have access to. It's not only questions of socioeconomic questions. Sorry, all the economists. You can't give answer to everything. And of course, there's also a transition that was mentioned yesterday from asking about access to asking about capabilities and the ability to use. So we employed I always have this, I lose the heartbeat. When you put photos, and then you make a presentation on the Mac, and then you move it to a Windows, usually the photos don't show, right? So this has worked now. So I'm so pleased that it worked. So we used, we employed a very, very old theoretical approach, talking about information use environments. In other words, remember, we were looking originally at how people access information and what their information needs were, more than at the centers themselves. And so we looked at this theoretical approach fit what we were looking for, because it's a theoretical approach that looks at how people create environments based on their information use, and how the fact that their similarity in accessing information is what creates their community. Originally, it was done in an information school, Taylor from Syracuse. It looked at information use environments of professionals. In other words, engineers have their information use environment, the doctors do, the nurses do, and so forth. But in the past 10 years or so, this theory has been used specifically with regards to needy communities and to low-income communities or disadvantaged communities in search of need for information. And so we decided to employ that as well, and so our questionnaire, which we'll talk about in a minute, tried to figure out 4 things. First, what kind of problems do people have? In other words, what are they trying to resolve? What kind of questions do they have? How do they describe their own needs? How do they describe themselves as a group? What is the setting and that is where technology steps in, but it's not only technology, it also has to do with their education and with their social networks. And then how do they feel that they have resolved the question that they have? The same methodological challenges that you presented yesterday for us as well. It's very hard to access the population in neighborhoods, in low-income neighborhoods. And we wouldn't want to do a phone survey, of course, because some people, as we'll soon show you, do not have phones, or they have prepaid mobile phones that are unlisted, so it's impossible to create that kind of a survey. It's very expensive to walk door to door and ask people if they have access, even though I understood that in Michigan they were doing some studies about that.
We did it.
You did it?
We did the door-to-door.
Okay, so you can tell me how hard it is, but and I can tell you that some of the neighborhoods that we were at were not safe enough also to do that. So another problem with our methodology is that we interview, of course, those that are using the centers. So we're not accessing the people that don't have access to information. So we're kind of losing a lot, and that's a problem. And it is a qualitative study, with all of the reliability issues that raises. However, it does provide us a lot of insight to actually talk to people and not just crunch numbers, as we found out. We did 71 interviews. Now, I don't know that we will fully analyze all 71. Some could have been problematic. Not all were at the same level of coherence as people we talked to, but basically they were visitors to the PCCs. We're still in the process of transcribing and analyzing those. What you'll see today is for the first round of analysis that we did for 20-something of them. We also interviewed people that work at the PCCs. That was the second stage. What I'm presenting here is partial data about that. The interviews, because they were designed to try to assess the people's needs. They were designed in a narrative interviewing technique where we asked people to tell us stories. So we didn't ask them a question, we didn't ask them how do you access information, we asked them to describe a situation where they needed to know something and how they tried to resolve that. It's a very tough technique. Sometimes you have to repeat that question many times. You give them an example. You say, okay, you needed a plumber, so immediately the conversation starts about plumbing. In other words, it's very, very hard to work on that. But after a while, it works. Also, some of the interviewees, they look at you and say, oh, so you want me to say computer, right? You want me to say Google. They think they know what the answer is. I said, no. I said, you tell me how you look for, how you found the plumber. So you so forth. So it's a tough back and forth with us. We conducted most of the interviews in the first part, and in the last part, we had the students that helped us. We had a small grant from Penn State to finish this. And we also have all of the logins of all the people that access the PCCs in Pittsburgh in the past year and a half since they started. But they're anonymized, we don't know who the people are, and we just took one small sample to show you. Right now we're working on exactly how to analyze this data to see what they actually do. So let's tell you what we found, and we'll go very quickly over the findings. So Pittsburgh Connects, there's a bridge there. Pittsburgh Connects is a program that had 4 functioning PCCs at a time. In other words, one closed down. I'll show you the map in a second. These PCCs are located in low-income neighborhoods. The original vision of these PCCs, as described by the people who wrote program was that they will be like nonprofit Starbucks. In other words, they said, we'll put nice chairs, nice sofas, people can sit down and feel comfortable. These computer centers have only laptops. Okay, so somebody was talking here yesterday about the thought that you walk into public computer centers, people sitting and typing. Right? No, here people are sitting with red laptops. They all have these HP laptops. They're all red. You can identify them when you're coming in, and they're accessing that. I'm running out of time. So this is what we have there. If you take a view at the city of Pittsburgh, these are the 5 centers. A little closer look. People know Pittsburgh, know what this is, but basically the one that's called Hill House up there in the center was closed down after the first year. Reasons for are unclear to us, and we won't get into that, and moved to a place called West End. Okay? Now, general data, this is data that is updated up to last summer. Okay, so it's being updated now we're actually doing the actual work right now of gathering the data for till April of this year. Each center had 5 users per day, as you can see, using 7.5 hours per day. You can see the numbers. I don't want to repeat them, and you can see something about the levels of education of the users. The centers have different opening hours. Each one of them is a different center, also in its setting. Okay, we have 4 different institutions where the computers are set at. One of them was an employment center in a neighborhood, and so the computers are an add-on there to what is going on there in the employment center, and it is the philosophy of the director of this place that everybody does everything. Coming into the computer center or coming to the employment center, so that also is a problem in evaluating what exactly is going on there. Another one is at a YMCA that existed already beforehand, and they put up a room just for the computers, but that YMCA also has an employment center on the 2nd floor. So the people that walk to the 2nd floor, they see the computer center. It's in a room that is all glass around it. So they stop by there, but it's not the employment center. It has its own dedicated staff, so it has a totally different character. The third one is a brand new one, the one that you saw at the West End. It just opened a couple of months ago. It works only half a day, and it's actually, again, it's an employment center, but it's a new employment center, unlike the first one I was discussing, which was going to go around for a long, long time. And the fourth one is the most amazing one. Was opened in a neighborhood that basically, it's hard to believe in 21st century America, is a neighborhood that has no social services whatsoever. People keep telling me there's nothing there. And I was like, what do you mean by nothing? Okay, but basically there's nothing. So there's a small library. There is a small library, a few hours a day. That's it. There's very small, few hours. It's down the street. This specific PCC was opened in a building. It was a condemned building. Okay, so you walk into this condemned building in the middle of a neighborhood that you have to close. They used to open the center till dark, but they have to close it earlier because it's not a safe neighborhood. And in a condemned building, and the computer center became the community center. It's a neighborhood that has nothing, right? So that's the only place, after school hours, all the kids from the neighborhood, that's where they come to a condemned building. Okay, this is what the city provides them as their after-school activity. So this is a unique, this place also is using its resources in very interesting ways that I don't have time to get to too much, but a very fascinating place. It's just basically become the center of the neighborhood. Okay, so that's it. Now, what do they provide in these computer centers? There is a basic skills training, and how much? I'm done. Not much. They provide education services, GEDs and credit recovery. employment services, as I've told you, a little bit health education, and also they opened a place to fix computers. So once in a while they have an open day, people bring their broken computers and they help them fix them. Okay? This is a sample of the people that we talked about. As you can see, very low income, and the difference between these two lists of 23 online users are the ones that we have captured their data, okay? And the 21 interviewees are the first interviews that we already finished analyzing, okay? So you can see here how much people are spending online. You can see that about half of the people try to access pornographic websites. And that everybody uses Facebook, just like in Texas, in Pennsylvania too, everybody uses Facebook. However, even though the computer center is at an employment center, they were not there, at least not the small sample that we had, looking for jobs. Okay. How did they learn out about this computer center? How did they find out where it is? I saw a lot about this that you talked about yesterday. Everything is through word of mouth. Okay, no advertising has been successful at all. People kept saying, I heard about it from a friend, I happened to go nearby, and so forth and so on. It's interesting that the staff has a different idea of why people are coming there, which people maybe cannot articulate themselves. For example, that it's a safe place, okay, that there is a sense of community in the place. There are many homeless people in these neighborhoods, and the computer center is the only place they can spend the day in a safe environment. It's unlike in libraries, there's unlimited access to the computer, as much time as they want, and there's enough of the computers. So there's 40 laptops in each one of these centers. What kind of problems people had? We divided them into different types of problems. There are personal problems. There were cases where people, we divided those into job seeking and health. We call them survival problems. And then there was things we call them authority seeking. You know, a mother comes to the computer center so she can help her kids doing homework. Okay, so she can answer questions that the kids have. Of course, there's issues of dealing with the government, institutional issues, privacy. People say in the library, I feel that they're seeing what I do. Here they don't, which of course is not true, but it doesn't matter. Because they did sign something saying. But as you can see, this is a nice quote from one of our interviews, the biggest difficulty is information itself, just knowing what question to ask. We asked, in one of the questions that we had was, what is the most common question asked? We asked the staff people. When the answer was, how do you switch this on? Okay, so that's could be one example. Overwhelmingly, this is what the people have at home. They all have TVs, they all have mobile phones, they do not have landlines, they don't read a paper newspaper, and the concept of radio is not radio they listen over the internet. There isn't radio at all. About the PCCs themselves, I've described what they look like and what's the setting as far as that's concerned. One of our bad tools is figuring resolution. Did you solve the problem that you were looking for? That's a bad question. Everybody says yes. So it's something that we need to refine somehow. There's a lot to say here, but basically I want to touch on one point because I know that I'm running out of time. As far as we are concerned, this is not about technology. This is about information. And it's about addressing the information needs of people. If there is one policy direction that things should go is to talk to people and ask them what their information needs are, and to design the computer center to answer people's information needs rather than design them looking at what kind of technology we can provide to people. So we looked at this, yes, there is a technology aspect to these computer centers, but mostly there is an information aspect and done. But I also want to state that one more thing is that we also have a community aspect. I think that the public computer center that I talked to you about, told you about, that became the community center is an example of what we call maybe an unintended consequence of policy that had a huge positive impact on the community. Thank you very much. As always, too much. That's life. The microphone. I can continue talking.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Will this work? Yes. I'm inviting you to a 3-stop train ride. So, even though I've been introduced as the one who's going to be talking about Colombia, I want to talk about a couple of things before the Colombia. You there? Before we get to Colombia, I've been looking at public access as an ecosystem. I come from the field of communication, even though I'm at the information school. And so there's a lot of tension between what is information, what is communication. We could have a whole program on that. And I started working on telecenters, community telecenters, the nonprofit Starbucks that you mentioned. The nonprofit centers that offer access to computers and technology, way back in 1997 and 98 when it was a brand new phenomenon. And then I came to the information school where I started looking at libraries as well. And through a grant of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, we studied public access computing in 25 developing countries around the world. And I managed to persuade them not to look only at libraries, which is what they originally wanted, but to look at the full ecosystem that included telecenters, broadly speaking, all the non-profit access centers that offer access to computers and technology, but also cyber cafes, internet cafes, that unlike the US are a very important phenomenon in developing countries. There's very few internet cafes in the US. Sometimes around the college you will see a place where they rent computers for the student whose computer crashed and still needs to print out a paper. But they're not a very profitable business in the US. They are thriving in the rest of the world, in the developing world. And many of you might have traveled internationally and gone to a cyber cafe, not to the library, to check in and do your online class. The first thing I want to emphasize is that these centers behave much like an ecosystem for the user, maybe not for the managers of the libraries or the telecenters or cyber cafes, or for the researchers about them, because each one of these worlds have lived in an isolated world, and the people working on telecenters have never looked in the direction of libraries, and people doing research about libraries in developing countries have rarely looked at telecenters, and neither of them have looked at cyber cafes overall. And yet cyber cafes are the most numerous kind of centers. And then we've been looking at those through this framework that we developed for this study back then, the ACE framework, where we're looking not just at access. It's not an issue of access alone. It's an issue of equitable access, where access has a few other components, not just the infrastructure, but the suitability and the affordability and the accessibility of the place, the hours of operation and the location. But we also look at the C component, the human capacity and the relevance, the local relevance of the services and the information that is provided. And we also look at the environment, the political environment, the popular support, the socio-cultural factors that enable or disable access and use. For example, in many Muslim countries, it's not okay for women to be out in the street alone and go to a cyber cafe. But a library is an okay place for them to be in. So there's all sorts of socio-cultural factors in the environment that enable or prevent effective use of these centers. So with this, we did a study in 25 countries. There's a big fat book. It's about 600 pages, and I understand the students that talked out yesterday managed to look at. It's for sale at a very expensive price by the publisher, but if you look around, you'll find bootleg versions of it on a PDF. And there's a detailed description and analysis of each one of the 25 countries.
and a number of chapters that analyze a number of issues across the board in these in the countries. The difference between the type of centers, the type of users. One of the most fascinating topics that we found was the perceptions of trust and what people trust in these places. And libraries are not necessarily the most trustworthy places. People do trust that they will find reliable information, but they generally think it's going to be completely outdated. An interesting phenomenon in former Soviet countries, people don't want to be caught dead in a library. They're associated with a former regime, and they're not a trustworthy place. So all sorts of differences between libraries and telecenters and cyber cafes in this. Now, doing an international study with local partners in each one of these countries did not really allow me to be in touch with what was going on, and I was really craving for some more direct face-to-face contact. So I ended up doing an in-depth study in Colombia after this. I grew up in Colombia, but the fact that it was in Colombia was random. We were going to do it in Honduras, because it was a smaller country, and then there was a coup in Honduras. And so we said, okay, forget it, we're not going to we'll rather do it in Colombia. And we were once again looking at the full ecosystem of libraries and telecenter and cyber cafes, going in a bit more depth, and using the same ACE framework, developing a bit further. And this gives you a picture of what is the place of libraries in relation to the others. And the shape of the curves is very similar of what the proportions are in Colombia and what the proportions are in the averages of the 25 countries. Libraries are not the center of the world. They're fairly marginal, and many of them don't even have access to computers. Many of them don't even have computers to run their collections or their operation, let alone having computers, nice bright red computers for users to come in and use. Now, in Colombia, where only about 500 of the 1,700 public libraries have access to computers, they have a plan now with an additional grant from the Gates Foundation that is in the final stages of negotiation after an interesting pilot to extend computer access, public access computing in all libraries by 2015, with a very interesting twist. And this is the first time the Gates Foundation is considering this. Years ago, we were challenging the foundation and other donors to not invest all their money, all the eggs in technology. Initially, we were saying, at least make it half and half. Half to purchase computers, and then the other half for all the support and the training and all the rest of the things that are needed. And then we upped the ante and saying, no, 80% should go to training and all the support services, and only 20% to the actual infrastructure and technology. Because the issue is not so much technology as what you do with it. The easiest thing is to set up computers, cut the ribbon, inaugurate the center, and walk away. And then nothing happens. How many of those centers die off and go unused afterwards? In this case, the Gates Foundation's budget for the Colombia project has 0 for technology. All of the budget will go to all the training and support and additional services, and the country has to figure out a way of supplying the technology from other sources, and the Ministry of Technology, Ministry of ICTs, that's what we call the Ministry of ICTs, of Information and Communication Technologies. So they have to partner with another ministry. Libraries depend on the Ministry of Culture, and technology depends on the Ministry of Communications, now Ministry of ICT. They have to partner. Imagine what a challenge between 2 different ministries to supply the computers so that the program of rolling out computers in libraries will actually work. Interesting challenge. We will see what happens. Now, libraries are not alone in that ecosystem. There's also telecenters. Many of them run by the other ministry, so there's public telecenters, and there's also private non-profit telecenters that offer all sorts of programs. Telecenters are not necessarily free. Sometimes they're subsidized, sometimes they're cheaper than cyber cafes. For the most part, libraries offer free services, even though I've been told many times people go and use computers and they go ask, where do I pay? And no, it's free. Oh, what do you mean? I don't have to pay anything? It kind of comes as a surprise. Because people are willing to pay for these services. And in fact, we found that fees are not a huge driver for people to choose one type of venue over another. What people will go to is a place where they find the kinds of services they want, the speed, air conditioning in very hot climates, but especially the place where my friends are hanging out. A cool hangout place is a lot more attractive, even if I have to pay. So fees are not a huge determinant factor in whether people will go to one place or another. And in fact, the majority of the places that are available are cyber cafes. The majority of them charge a fee. Some of them are free as long as you eat something. So if you buy a sandwich or a Coke or something, then you have a half an hour on the computer for free. So you're paying something. And I asked one of the guys, what is the business? Is it the food or is it the computer? And he said, well, it's both. One draws the other. And sometimes one is free as long as you use the other. But usually there's more fees associated with that end of the spectrum than with the libraries. Now I hear library people saying, well, we're in a crisis, we have no budget, that's our biggest challenge, sustainability. Well, we're seeing a population that is willing to pay. It sounds anathema to the library world to say you can charge, but people are willing to pay. So I leave that as an interesting thought for you. Now, an interesting thing we did in Colombia was we started asking people, well, what difference does this make to you? How has this changed your life? So in a survey of 1,000 people, we included an open-ended question that we recorded for about half of them and took notes for the other half, and then transcribed and grouped the kinds of answers that people are talking about. How has this changed your life? Trying to be very open so that there is room for a negative space. Now, there is a very positive bias in responses, and when you explicitly ask, has there been any negative thing that happened in your life? In my experience, I've been finding that about half the people say, negative? What do you mean? It's all positive. But then the other half say, oh yeah, I'm glad you asked. So opening the door to asking about negative consequences is a super important thing. Asking in an open-ended way gives us about 3% of people saying, oh yeah, there is an addiction, there is spending more time in front of the computer, there's ways spending more time because my kids are playing games, there's plagiarism, there's privacy, virus, and all these kinds of things. It'd be very interesting to dig deeper into this. So I add those kind of questions to the questions that you were posing before. Is this for efficiency or just for effectiveness or for efficiency? Is it for downsizing government and shifting problems anywhere? Is this something that's actually helping people? Or is this creating a new breed of people who will eventually be addicted to technology, and then we'll be looking for withdrawal ways of how to get people untethered from their devices, which is another interesting phenomenon going on. Now, the largest group of answers are related to, well, yeah, more information, access to more, faster, cheaper, easier sources of information, which is kind of not very revealing, because it's information about anything, and it's, yes, faster, cheaper, and more. That's great. That's 41%. But then, about a quarter of them talk about things that have to do with relationships. Very few of them talk about jobs, about health, about the kind of things that we've been led to believe that are what makes a difference. And I was blown away by the quality of what you guys presented yesterday on the study in Texas, which, by the way, could be very replicable in the types of challenges and findings of what we did in Colombia. But we do not find all this emphasis on jobs. Yes, this is making a difference for us to find jobs, because there aren't any jobs. And yet people are going to the computer places. To do what? Yes, sometimes to apply for a job or to get your police record, because that's what is required for something, so that's transactions. But we had to bundle under transactions and e-commerce and jobs and looking for jobs and all this together so that they would show up on the pie chart. Otherwise, the jobs component and employment component would be so small that it would disappear. The literature tells us that it's all about jobs and employment. Well, there isn't much of that. What we do find is relationships. What do people want? what do people value, how has this transformed their lives, is through stronger, better, deeper relationships. Friends and family, number one. Not just maintaining relationships, but making new friends. About half of them talked about making new friends. New friends that they will probably never meet in person in their lives. But this is transforming the way we are relating to each other. Now, an interesting emergent thought that we started seeing is a sense of connectedness. Not just having more friends, but being part of a broader community, being part of the world, being part of my town in a different way. So exploring this sense of connectedness was something really interesting. And then entertainment as a way of maintaining relationships, watching films together, sharing music, playing games online, as a way of staying in touch with my friends and family. So this notion of relationships is really the most salient effect that people report as the perceived benefit of using computers in these public places. It's not about jobs, it's about relationships.
Do you have any age demographics on your sample?
Yes, it's very similar to what they presented yesterday. We had the same limitation. IRB did not let us talk to anybody under 18, even though the majority of the users are kids under 18. And it followed the same curve that they presented yesterday. It's roughly middle-aged people, mostly more or less well-educated comparatively, mostly more or less in the lower to middle income brackets. It's not the poorest of the poor. It's not the ones with no education. It's students, elementary, high school, college students, or people with a level of education and a level of income who are going to them. So the demographics are very similar to what you guys found here in Texas, which correspond also roughly to the demographics of the broader study in 25 countries. So I was signed with the same kind of relief. Whew, well, it's the same kind of picture. In Texas, in Colombia, or averaging through 25 countries. Same kind of logic. Now, this focus on relationships has led us to start thinking, when we're evaluating the impact of public access computing, we might be looking at the wrong things. If we're only looking for what difference has this made in terms of employment and jobs and income, more income in my pocket, we might be missing the boat. In fact, sometimes more income and more entrepreneurship is exactly contrary to what we're trying to do. We were working with homeless kids in Colombia, and one night from a halfway house, one of the girls slipped out and came back 3 days later with new makeup, with new clothes, with more cash, and we had found out that she had boosted her prostitution business through her newly acquired online tools. In the books, that should be a great success. She made more money. That is not what we want. So it started to put me thinking, well, really, is it all just about jobs and employment and income?
Jobs,
Huh?
employment and income.
The what?
That was about jobs, employment and income.
Yes. Yes. So if that's all we're promoting, well, in many cases, and many of these are kids and students, well, that's not the kind of thing that we're looking for. That's not the kind of behavior that we want to be promoting. So what is it then? We look at that pie and say, well, yeah, there's something about learning, not just education, because each one of those has its own call out. So learning has to do with, yes, homework and research, but also for teachers to be able to post grades, and for people who be able to take online courses, and also for people report a sense of wonder at learning about all sorts of stuff going on around the world, even if it's not for a class. I love learning about stuff that is going on, being up to date on new things in science and new discoveries, and a sense of wonder about the greatness of the world, which is not strictly tied to education in the formal sense. And transactions then I mentioned includes online transactions for e-commerce, for e-government, for getting your background check or your police record, or people checking to see whether their pension has been deposited, and that kind of thing. But only bundled together do they come up to something that adds up to 13%. And yet that is what we've been led to say that is the most important thing. Now, well, there's some quotes of the kinds of things that they say. While you read it, I'll tell you the prelude to the next one is, I've been starting to think of how do we measure the kind of intangible benefits that would not be necessarily measured or captured by traditional measures of economic growth and human development in the traditional sense. So we've come up with something that we're calling community wellness outcomes. And what we're developing right now is ways to instrument and measure these community wellness outcomes as something that might complement the more traditional measures. In which, if we were able to measure in some way, so we're looking at both qualitative and quantitative ways of measuring these through interviews and through surveys or scales, things related to empowerment and things related to social or cultural capital. Some of them are more individual in nature, some of them are more collective in nature. But I get the feeling that this would give us a picture that would give us a lot more depth and substance to the kind of transformations that people are experiencing. While, remember, maintaining an open-ended eye to the negative consequences as well. But if we were able to look at things like self-efficacy and changes in self-efficacy, slightly different than self-esteem, but we might end up merging them together. Measures of aspirations and how people now have a better sense of a future for themselves. Because now the world is bigger. Because now I can have a sense of me being successful in life and how that sets me on a path to a different future. Even if I'm not getting a job. But having a different sense of aspirations and where I can take my life.